Hi, welcome to Navigating the Chemical Safety Landscape. I'm Kathleen Schuler with the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Before we get started with our speakers, I just wanted to mention a couple of technical things. You can switch from your computer mic speakers to the phone in. There's a number on your screen you can dial in and use the audio PIN number as well. You can enter a question at any time during the webinar in the little question panel. Please submit your questions and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and will be available at iatp.org. And we'll send you a follow-up email and let you know. IATP is partnering with Lynn Katz-Cherry and the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network in hosting this webinar series. The series is part of the Great Lakes Protection Fund project to conduct business trainings on green chemistry tools. We are pleased to welcome today's speakers, Mark Rossi, Roger McFadden, and Bryan McGannon. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to thank the webinar series co-sponsors. In addition to IATP and the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network, sponsors include the American Sustainable Business Council, Clean Production Action, the Minnesota Green Chemistry Forum, and the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute at Rochester Institute of Technology. We are fortunate to be able to hear from 3 leaders in green chemistry and sustainable business practices. Our first speaker is Mark Rossi. Mark is co-director of Clean Production Action and the chair and founder of the Biz-NGO. Dr. Rossi is co-author of Clean Production Action's Green Screen for Safer Chemicals and the Biz-NGO Guide for Safer Chemicals. And his complete bio is available on the website. So we're going to turn it over to Mark right now.
Thank you, Kathleen, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to be presenting on the work that we've been doing through Biz-NGO, but I'm going to just get started here. Let me get going here with PowerPoint. Start with just a little quickie introduction to Clean Production Action. Clean Production Action is a nonprofit organization that focuses on promoting safer alternatives to chemicals of concern to human health and the environment. And as Kathleen mentioned, we have 2 main programs, the Green Screen for Safer Chemicals and Biz-NGO. And Biz-NGO is a collaboration of businesses, advocacy organizations, government agencies, and universities who are working together to advance safer chemicals and sustainable materials. But I mean, to get started, and just to put a point on, why are we concerned with chemicals in the environment and chemicals in people? And there's a variety of reasons that we have these concerns, and part of it's environmental, and part of it's related to human health. And part of the environmental point, and here is a graphic of air and water flows that shows why certain types of chemicals, and we call these persistent and bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals, end up concentrating in the North Pole and in the Arctic regions, because some chemicals like lead or DDT are persistent, right? They don't break down. Once they're in the environment, they will travel around, and they travel around, and then if they also have the characteristic of being bioaccumulative, they accumulate as they move up the food chain, growing in concentrations, and then if they're toxic, right, now they have this opportunity to exert their effect, and because they're bioaccumulative, right, the exposure levels are increasing. And so some of the ironies is polar bears, animals, and humans that are at the top of the food chain in the northern regions have some of the highest concentrations of these industrial chemicals, even though they are thousands of miles away from the sources of those chemicals. And there's growing concern with the exposure of chemicals at early stages of development, and we call these moments, right, we have windows of vulnerability. The developing fetuses, right, and babies and infants, right, they're developing rapidly. their reproductive systems, their brains are all developing very quickly, and their development is turned off and on by the endocrine system. And the endocrine system operates at minute concentrations, right? Parts per trillion, parts per quadrillion. So it's very small amounts of chemicals are having significant impact and value, right, to the developing organism, be it a human or an animal. And if you're exposed to a certain type of chemical that can turn off or turn on the endocrine system at the wrong moment, then you can get some adverse health effects. And what we're seeing is there's a number of chronic diseases that are associated with exposure to toxic chemicals. Developmental disabilities, childhood cancer, Parkinson's disease, neurodevelopmental disabilities, neurobehavior disorders. You can see the list here on the screen. It's very hard to pinpoint exactly through epidemiological studies, right, that if you're exposed to this chemical, this adverse effect that you have, this cancer, right, the skin cancer, happened because of that exposure of the chemical. But right, we can extrapolate from animal studies to say there's this likelihood that certain percentages of these diseases are being caused by exposure to chemicals. So we know that certain chemicals, right, are persistent, bioaccumulative, toxic, and others are just standalone toxic chemicals. And so the drive is, how do we avoid those chemicals, right? How do we avoid these chemicals of concern and move to safer alternatives? And that's where the work of Clean Production Action is all right, now what are the solutions? How do we get to safer alternatives? Another driver, just to put another point on the reasons for taking action, is that if you do have chemicals of concern to human health and the environment, toxic chemicals, in your products or your supply chains, they are a liability. Now, whether that liability is ever exerted on a product, on a company, you don't know, right? But by having that chemical in your product, a chemical of concern in your product, in your supply chain, you carry a liability. And there's a list here, and I'll go into these in more detail. So here's some examples of fines and recalls and the costs associated with them of specific companies. So recently, in the past 3 years, Walmart, Target, Walgreens, and CVS have all had fines for the mismanagement of chemicals that break or get returned that they have on their shelves, right? They're on their shelves. It's not listed as like hazardous chemical, toxic chemical, but if that product breaks because of what's in it, it then becomes a hazardous waste and it has to be disposed of as hazardous waste, right? So here's an example of, oh, we think it's safe, it's in a product, it's on a shelf, but now it breaks, now it has to be treated as hazardous waste. You just can't take that product and throw it down the drain, take that product and throw it in a dumpster in the back. Recalls. Sony had its PlayStations recalled in the early 2000s in Europe because of contamination with cadmium. Mattel, many of you may be familiar with that, with their issues with lead and other chemicals in their products because of mismanagement of the supply chain, had to recall, millions of products, $110 million in costs around the recall, stock price down 18% over an eight-month period. So there's a clear set of liabilities that are associated, right, with carrying these chemicals in the products. And if you can get away from those liabilities, then you avoid them. And just quickly, 2 other examples. SIG USA, the water bottle manufacturer, filed for bankruptcy in the U.S. The Swiss-based company, its subsidiary, was forced to file for bankruptcy in 2011 because it did not disclose that it had a liner of BPA on the inside of the bottle. And this was during a period when their sales were climbing rapidly because consumers wanted BPA-free water bottles. And they knew the BPA was there and didn't reveal it. A similar type of case, Johnson & Johnson in China knew that it had chemicals of concern in its baby products like shampoos, said it's at a lower concentration, we're not going to take those out. There's a huge, it was revealed that those chemicals were in the products. Chinese consumers reacted and said, we're not going to buy the products. This major supermarket chain, for example, pulled all those J&J products out of 3,500 stores. Over this time period, J&J's market share for baby products declined by almost 10%. So, I mean, so there's this clear liability, right? If you have a toxic chemical in your product or your supply chain, it sits there, and if it comes to light and there's a advocacy campaign, a market campaign, then you could be paying the price for that. So some of the trends, right, in chemical safety. So there's growing trends around transparency, supply chain management, I've been touching on that, market and advocacy demands, regulations, these restricted RSLs, the restricted substances lists, SVHC, they're substances of very high concern. In REACH, we have chemicals of concern in California, right? So different lists of types of chemicals of concern. And I see the trajectory of all of this is increasingly there's going to be a demand to measure what is your chemical footprint. So just a note on transparency. Just in general, in the business community, there's a growing recognition that companies are going to have to be more transparent about their actions, and it's not just the actions that are related to core activities, but that there's these different tiers of transparency that companies are increasingly getting engaged in. And this is an article from the Harvard Business Review. I believe this was in 2009, and it talks about leadership in the age of transparency. And you start with your core business, but then there's taking ownership, right? It's directly traceable to your organization. For example, your supply chain, right? That's near and dear to you. You can have liabilities associated with that. Just talking about that in the previous slide. Take action, which is something that impacts you contribute to and have unique problem-solving capabilities. And this can, for example, would be in sector-type initiatives, like the Outdoor Industry Association's work on the Chemical Management Framework. And then take interest where you don't have special competence to address the issues, and that could be areas like public policy. So, I mean, one of the challenges and the trends here is managing the complex supply chains, and how do you get back to your T2 and Tier 2, Tier 3, and higher suppliers where chemical decisions are being made, right? That's a challenge that needs to be addressed. What we're seeing is many different consumer campaigns, advocacy campaigns, in these different areas. Something to take note of, if you don't know about it already, is the Health Product Declaration. This is an initiative for promoting transparency of chemical ingredients in building products. It's now been integrated into LEED, the U.S. Green Building Council's Green Building Standard LEED. You've got a campaign by Greenpeace targeting apparel brands because of pollution in China, right, getting back to the whole supply chain issues. We have a Mind the Store campaign targeting hazardous 100 chemicals in retail stores in the U.S. And this is just, right, a tip of the iceberg of the different types of advocacy campaigns. This is a slide from Hayworth, they're a furniture manufacturer, that talks about what are the key issues, environmental issues for the companies that it's selling to its major targeted customers, and top 12% and top 25%. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here, one of the most demanded elements is health and chemistry, right? Almost at the same level as the sustainable supply chain, almost at the level of a carbon footprint. And now we know that health and chemistry in LEED v4 is now being integrated into LEED version 4. And one of the trends, and this gets out to another driver to be ahead of the regulatory environment and to be ahead of the marketplace demands and the advocacy demands, right? Is like, well, and I'm going to come to this point, which is how do you get ahead of this? But one of the issues here is, right, that there's constantly new and emerging chemicals that are being identified of concern in different sectors, in products, in supply chains. And this is, I love this slide. I'd like to take, I wish I had put it together, but it was done by the Healthy Building Network, taking a look at chemicals of concern and lists in the building sector. So this is LEED new construction, starts out with halons, CFCs, VOCs. Then you get a green guide for healthcare. It includes those chemicals, and that adds in a whole bunch of PVT chemicals, lead, mercury, cadmium, phthalates, PBDEs. Then you get LEED for healthcare. Okay, it adds in more chemicals, LEED pilots, right? So now you're getting antimicrobials, formaldehyde, halogen flame retardants, gets added in LEED pilots. Then there's the living building challenge, another area adds arsenic. Then you get a Perkins and Will list, adds asthmagens and polyurethane and others. And then you get a living building challenge list. I mean, so you see, right? So you're constantly, and this is over a period of 10 years, right? The lists and the chemicals of concern are constantly growing. So the challenge and the opportunity is getting out ahead of that. So how do you get out ahead of this? How do you get out ahead of the chemical du jour, the chemical of the month, get ahead of the potential advocacy campaigns? And what I'm going to walk you through is really a strategy and a framework for how to be ahead of the regulatory and market initiatives around chemicals, toxic chemicals and products and supply chains. So Biz-NGO, a collaboration of these organizations and many others, created a set of principles based on best practices in companies across all sectors. And so we rolled it up to come up with the very best practices. So one is you know the chemicals in your products and supply chains, and that those get disclosed publicly. Disclosed is always a challenge, but there's that commitment. The second point, right, is now that you know the chemicals in your products, you have them assessed, you have identified the chemicals of concern, and you avoid those most hazardous chemicals. 3, you set up internal management systems to implement this program, commit to continuous improvement. And then 4, you engage externally to help accelerate the movement to safer chemicals through supporting public policies and industry standards and participating in different sectoral initiatives. And all the leading companies are doing parts of these, right? They're not, I think very few companies are actually hitting on all these principles, but they're doing parts of them. And what we did was we created a guidance document to say, okay, well, what are companies doing around each of these 4 principles? And what's that trajectory look like in terms of more and more ambitious practices? So we created this Guide to Safer Chemicals. It's actually a really great resource. It goes through each one of these principles and provides examples and tools and resources for what companies are doing in each of these areas. And we walk through a lot of the work in the building products, electronics, apparel, healthcare, general consumer product sectors is all embedded into this report. So it's a great resource for finding out, what are companies doing. But one of the places that many companies, when they start on the journey to safer chemicals, begins with a chemicals policy. Some companies start with chemicals, a policy, an organizational policy. Others will just jump right in and say, here's a chemical of concern, what are we doing about it? But for companies starting at the policy level, what I put up here is different elements that we're seeing in chemicals policies within companies, right? It specifies regulatory compliance, and it's publicly available, so right at baseline level. Specifies policy actions beyond regulatory compliance. And again, there's this commitment to making these policies publicly available. Has a process for setting goals and measuring progress towards these goals, right? Getting to be more ambitious and then publicly reporting on the progress towards those goals. I'd say one of the very interesting initiatives, if you haven't heard of it, it's called the Zero Discharge to Hazardous Chemicals Initiative in the apparel and footwear sector, ZDHC. You can go check that out on the website. And one of the companies that's participating in that is Levi Strauss. So they've set a goal, right? They've set a goal of zero discharge of hazardous chemicals. So this is in their supply chain by 2020. And these companies are reporting annually, if not more frequently, on their progress towards those goals. So that's an example of a policy and its implementation. Hanes Brands Initiative also has set up a chemical management systems. They have a whole internal system, right, for how they do this. chemical improvement system, chemical database, restricted substance list. So, and this is something that Biz-NGO is working on, is creating the set of resources and policies that organizations have. I know the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council also has a list of policies on their website. And then what's the scope? So there's the structure of the chemicals policy, and then what's addressed in it. And so there's, again, different tiers or scopes, depth that companies are going into, depth and breadth, going from chemicals and products, right, to chemicals and supply chain, to safer alternatives, to engagement in public policy. And so here's an example. This is in the healthcare sector, Dignity Health, a major healthcare provider in the western U.S. They have adopted, as part of their chemicals policy, comprehensive chemicals program, the Biz-NGO principles, and they've integrated that into their chemicals policy, and they're then integrating that in their organization. Okay, so that's policies. Now, another critical element, right, of getting ahead of sort of the toxic chemical du jour is, what do you know about the chemicals in your products and your supply chains? Right, everybody starts out at meeting applicable regulations, right? So that's the baseline. But beyond that, right, beyond that, what are the regulatory requirements? What are companies doing? Well, there's oftentimes finding chemicals of concern that are based on lists, or there could be a list for your sector. So in the apparel sector, there's a firm. So they've created a set of lists of chemicals of concern, largely based on global regulations. They rolled out that into a list of basically RSL, restricted substance list, for their whole sector. You go even further, though, and say, oh, we want to really know chemicals of concern based on a set of criteria, like the Green Screen Benchmark 1 criteria. Or, some companies are getting very ambitious, right, and say, well, we want to know all the chemicals and products and components that are supplied to us. And a lot of companies actually will have that data sent to a third party rather than directly to you. But that enables you to say, okay, when a new chemical of concern emerges, right, from REACH or from LEAD, then you would get, you could go into your list of chemicals and say, do we have that chemical on in our products? So here's an example. This slide is from Seagate, and here's all the chemicals, and they have it by concentration that are going into their hard drive. So Seagate's a leading manufacturer of hard drives. They require their suppliers to provide chemical ingredient disclosure for all the components that go into their products, and they have collected all that information. But if a new chemical concern comes up, they can go in here and find out if that chemical is in their products. And what that does for Seagate, the red line here is, if you don't set up a system, every time there's a new demand, you have to go back into your supply chain and ask the same suppliers a different question. And what Seagate has done is to say, we're going to get ahead of this. We have the information. Yeah, there was an initial cost to set up this system that made it very costly, but now that we've got that system set up, right, the cost has leveled out over time. Actually, if you went back to it, it's starting to kick up a little bit here, and that's because of the need to manage conflict minerals, which is a whole challenge for the electronic sector. All right, so now you know the chemicals in your products. All right, what's the strategy to identify chemicals of concern and move to safer alternatives? So here, you really need a system in place or tool that you're using, like the green screen, to identify chemicals of concern. Cradle to Cradle has its own system. There's other, Sidera Lens is another system. But there's systems and tools in place to identify the chemicals of concern and then enable you to identify alternatives. And what I'm doing is walking you through a whole set of references that are in the, and materials that are in the Guide to Safer Chemicals. Now here's going back to Levi Strauss. They see a benefit, right, in taking a hazard-based approach to addressing chemicals of concern, right? They see it as providing better visibility into their formulations. making informed decisions right upstream, saying, okay, we know that chemical is of concern, it's a hazardous chemical, we're going to move away from it and not say, oh, we have to do an exposure assessment to say, well, is there levels of exposure that are leading to adverse health effects? No, they're saying, oh, we're going to be preventive and get out ahead of that. And this is from Hanes Brands. They've also created a whole system. There's hazard and risk integrated into their system, and then they're doing alternative assessments. HP uses the green screen, to choose alternatives to substance of concern. And it enables them to get away from this regrettable substitution. Here you have HP saying, okay, we're going to get out of these halogenated flame retardants and move to safer alternatives. We want to make sure it's a safer alternative. The green screen gives you a framework for making sure that you don't end up in the place of a regrettable substitution. Some of the most ambitious companies are then disclosing out to the public chemicals in their products and chemicals in their supply chain. At the base level, we have compliance with laws like the safety data sheets. Some companies might disclose their restricted substance list or chemicals of concern in products. Usually it's more, oh, we are BPA free, we're phthalate free, we're halogenated flame retardant free. Not so much, you don't see so much disclosure of chemical of concern. But we are seeing, and I'm just going to look at the cleaning product sector, companies are disclosing all chemicals except those covered by non-disclosure agreements. This is Clorox and SC Johnson. So they'll provide all that information, and then they have created a strategy for actually disclosing fragrances where they list all fragrances. You can disclose chemicals and products on the website. There's the health product declaration where companies are now starting to disclose more chemicals, but not all of them. And at the highest level is disclosing all the chemicals in the product on label or on packaging. Seventh Generation is doing this. Whole Foods Market actually has a standard that requires disclosure of chemicals and products. So in certain product categories, and I would call those chemical intensive products, we're seeing a lot more disclosure. In the hard products, the so-called articles, you're seeing lesser disclosure, but I provided that example earlier of what Seagate is doing, which is a major initiative to disclose more about the chemicals in their products. Okay, so a whole lot there, The whole idea, though, is getting ahead of the game, not getting rid of that toxic chemical liability, and also doing good for people and the environment. So, what do you need to do, Well, you need to know chemicals and products and processes. The easiest way of getting started on that is to start with some list of chemical of high concern for your sector. Say, okay, we're going to start with this list of chemicals of high concern. Many sectors call them restricted substances lists. Okay, here's my list. Do we have any of these chemicals of concern in our products? Going more and more in depth, you find you have the goal of knowing more and more about the chemicals in your products and manufacturing processes in your supply chains. Ultimately, as you identify those chemicals of concern, then you have to move into alternatives. And here, it's a critical moment of doing an evaluation of the alternatives to make sure you don't have, say, for a regrettable substitution. And the easiest way is to adopt tools and systems for implementing this. I'll make a plug. Well, I've got it here later too, but for the Outdoor Industry Association's Chemical Management Framework, is a great resource, and actually in a future webinar you're going to hear more about that. And so here's an example. Pull up a slide from Hayworth of an organization that is doing many of these things. They've got a process to identify harmful materials, an internal review. They have supplier disclosure down to 100 ppm, 100 parts per million. They review it. They find cleaner alternatives. And of course, the alternatives have to meet their cost and performance specifications. And then they work with their supply chain to do the evaluations, identify the alternatives, and then they implement it. A really good example of here's how you go and move to safer materials in your organization. And they have a goal, 100% safe materials. I mean, just in general, like as we think about, where the leaders are, right? They've moved from being passive and waiting for regulations and market forces to drop on them, and they're getting ahead of it. And I've hit on all these points. I mean, I think another area, I'll just highlight this again, is increasing transparency. That's just, we're going to see more of that, right? There's just going to be more and more demand to know what the chemicals are in your products and your supply chains. And a number of initiatives that are happening for getting further resource, Practice Green Health, Outdoor Industry Association I mentioned, the U.S. Green Building Council Lead D4. This is the roadmap to zero discharge of hazardous chemicals, and Biz-NGO Working Group, and our website, bizNGO.org, has a lot of great resources. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you, Kathleen, and to the whole crew there in the Great Lakes region for putting on this great set of webinars and trainings. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was a great overview. Now I'd like to introduce Roger McFadden, our next speaker. Roger is the Vice President and Senior Scientist at Staples. He has been a leader in advancing green chemistry not only at Staples but nationally. And Roger believes that we need a revolution in product design with an environmental conscience and commitment to green chemistry. Roger, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. And Mark, as always, you do such an excellent job at Biz-NGO and Clean Production Action on continuing to advance this idea of moving in an orderly fashion to safer chemicals, materials, and products. So thank you for all the work that you do, Mark, and all of your colleagues. It's so helpful to companies like Staples and many of the companies that you just mentioned in your presentation. We're often asked at Staples, why are we doing this? Why are we investing in looking at chemicals and products? And there's a number of reasons why our company, as well as many of our retailer and B2B competitors, are working in this space today. So I'd like to share in the next few minutes some of the drivers that are in play today in our businesses that are helping us drive these changes in our supply chains. We recognize the value and economic benefits when toxic inputs are eliminated or reduced. It's not only the right thing to do for a business to help create shared value for customers and communities, but when we do it right, we'll create sustainable platforms for our companies to keep them in business and to stay in front of regulatory compliance and reducing potential liabilities. And at the end of the day, doing the most important thing that any business needs to do, and that is to meet the demand and continuing demand from our customers who are our bosses. So this is good for business. And as Mark said, this is an age of transparency. And as much as it's challenging to organizations to figure out how to communicate these kinds of things throughout its supply chain, nevertheless, we are going to have to find ways to do it better and better as we go forward. So let's look at some of these drivers and see if any of these resonate with your organization. The first one is the driver of consumers. This notion that consumers are bosses is very strategic, and there's some very interesting things happening in this world today. There's this rising role of social media. It can't be ignored. It adds millions of faces to the media. It's no longer just our favorite news anchor, Ron Burgundy, kid, that processes, prioritizes, and communicates information to us in a, kind of scheduled newscast. We're getting information instantly in a 24/7 global media sharing, or as some call it, crowdsourcing. And there's also this push for increased number of scientific and medical studies and articles that are out there that the consumer is reading and is beginning to digest and to try to process into their real world. There's also this growing consumer demand and expectation for radical transparency. And of course, certainly there's this also backdrop of regulations that come along with this. We happen to believe that regulations are laggard in many cases, particularly in the United States. By the time regulations kick in, most of the damage has been done, and we're just trying to take preemptive action, or excuse me, we're trying to take reactive action rather than proactive action. And we believe that businesses can play a role in doing this more proactively. One of the things Mark talked about, and this is very important for us to recognize, is that there are medical studies today that indicate that we do have chemicals that are showing up in babies' blood at birth. Though some would call this kind of the sky is falling and overreacting to this, it's important that we use it as a wake-up call. We don't certainly know all the answers to this yet. There's certainly a lot of questions that need to be answered around this, but it does make us interested in knowing more. For instance, how are these chemicals getting into the human body? You know, are the exposures significant enough to cause harm, either short-term or long-term? You know, further studies are needed in this area, and it's good to know that there's organizations working on this now, and including industry. Industry can play a huge role in this as well to help do these studies and to communicate the results of these studies so that we can make more informed choices. The next driver is procurement. Procurement's interesting. The growing demand for safer chemistry is showing up now in RFPs and RFIs, not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector. So we're beginning to see not only public RFPs, like this example in the state of Oregon, where there's very specific chemicals called out in the particular RFP, saying we don't want products that contain these particular chemicals. And so it changes the game because it's no longer a battle over policy making, it's really a battle in the marketplace itself. And if we want to do business with the state of Oregon, then we'll have to comply. And so, you know, customers are the boss here. So in the policy-making arena, businesses will often push back and aggressively fight policies that make them take specific actions related to chemicals and products. But when customers specify it, then it's an entirely different response, isn't it? Though they may still attempt to inform the process, they are much less likely to risk being locked out or losing the business. So very important to recognize that we have a marketplace that's being driven by this too. In the public sector, we're seeing a lot of this in healthcare. We see leadership healthcare organizations beginning to ask specifically questions of their suppliers about chemicals and products. This drives change because it brings awareness often to the retailer or to the distributor or supplier who may themselves not have known that these particular chemicals were in products, and allows them to have dialogue with their suppliers to make changes. The next one is green buildings. Mark talked a little bit about that. We have a lot going on in that space today, a lot of drivers there. You've got the U.S. Green Building Council, the Living Building Challenge. These are groups and that are looking at specific chemical avoidance in building materials. And this is driving change to create new dialogues between suppliers and customers, and between suppliers and chemical companies, frankly, to begin to move this discussion away from the last 10 years, which has been primarily focused around the bad, and moving it more towards a discussion of the high level of good. In other words, what kinds of chemicals should we be asking for in our products versus what should we be avoiding, as an example. The next one is schools. Interesting activity in the school sector. There's a number of chemicals that companies like ours are being asked to take a look at and to validate with our customers on whether or not these chemicals reside in products that we offer or processes. more than 53 million children and 6 million adults in the United States spend their days every day in elementary schools and secondary schools. You know, reducing the environmental risk inside these buildings is critical to maintaining a solid public health image. So there's a lot of work being done that's driving this within the school sectors. Another one is health. The healthcare area. As I mentioned earlier, there's a number of specific healthcare organizations that are working on this, but there's also some great organizations out there practice green health, healthcare without harm, Healthy Hospitals Initiative. There's organizations like the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production and you know, Physicians for Social Responsibility. There's a number of organizations, and many that I didn't mention here, that are really focusing in and realizing to do no harm expands beyond simply how we care for patients. We should try to do no harm in all of the specific areas that we operate our businesses in where we're capable of doing that. The next area is consumer products and packaging. This is important to us at Staples because we you know, carry an awful lot of products, and a lot of our competitors do as well. So it's important for us to recognize that there is a lack of knowledge and information, as Mark talked about earlier, in this area of what's in products, consumer products, and packaging today. So let me, one caveat, the idea here isn't to talk about chemicals being bad. There's so much good that chemicals have brought to us in this last few decades. A lot of breakthroughs in medicine, and lots of really beneficial products have been designed around innovative chemistry. So the notion here isn't to indict the chemical industry itself. The damage that the chemical industry has done is well documented throughout the last few decades. But the real reality is that the chemical industry has done huge good to bring good products to us. What we need to do is encourage that with the chemical companies so they recognize that doing that kind of thing is so important. But I wish I could report that all chemicals were created equal, that they're all safe, that they're all equally safe. But the reality is chemicals are not created equal. They have different hazard traits. They have different human health and ecotoxicity endpoints, et cetera, as you can see on this slide. And so we have to recognize that and begin to differentiate where these chemicals can be used safely in the type of products that we have that we interface to our consumer human beings with. The economic impact is huge, and we don't always look at this enough. We need to begin to look at the externality costs associated with chemicals and products. We often don't consider the end of life in the product itself. It's a real cost to society when we have these chemicals end up in our waste streams that we later generations have to pay for. There's many examples of that. So we have to begin to extend ourselves beyond just thinking quarter to quarter and think about the impact long term. And the good news is many companies are beginning to do that more than ever before. So our challenges to your organization and folks like you is to begin to help capture these costs so that we can begin to use them within our organizations to persuade those who have the purse strings in our organizations to invest more in capturing these lost assets, if you will, that we have out there today. Then there's this driver of regulations. I talked a little bit about it. Tends to be laggard, but you know, there's 28 states right now that have toxic chemical legislation. Now, not all of these are going to pass. There's all kinds of battles that go on in the communities around these, but it does indicate that the grassroots folks out there today are concerned about toxics in products and are attempting to find ways to fix the problem. And this is just another driver and indicator of that. The competitive marketplace may be where we can do the most good, and it's really great to see that associations like the apparel industry and other groups are beginning to work together collaboratively to find ways to solve this. The pre-competitive notion of doing this together to benefit all businesses really makes a lot of sense, but at the same time allowing the competitive nature of things to play out in the marketplace is important as well. But there are a lot of companies who recognize we can't do this alone. We need to be able to bond together where we can and tackle some of these challenges together, and that we can't do individually. But suppliers, just like chemicals, aren't created equal either. They are in different stages. We have to recognize that. So when we work with our suppliers at Staples, we recognize that they're going to be in different boxes here. And we want to encourage them to be in the far right, and we're doing more and more of that. But we also have to recognize that companies have to be given time to make changes. But we need to nurture that, and we need to encourage that and put challenges out there to give them opportunities to grow. The last thing is that the good news, I mean, there's a lot of bad news related to this area I suspect we hear about often. But the good news is that there are leadership companies. Mark talked about some of those. Bryan will probably share that as well. His organization is working very positively in this space. Kathleen, you and your group are doing wonderful things as well. But at the end of the day, what this is about for companies is to protect and build brand reputation. The thing they want to protect in any company is their brand. They've spent huge amounts of resources and assets to build a strong brand to its customer. The last thing they want is for that to be damaged and tarnished. And not only that, they want to build that brand. Actually, they want to make it stronger. And this is an area where companies see that. They want to avoid the risks associated with harmful chemicals. They want to avoid the costs associated with those and the impact on brand. They want to be proactive. We're seeing a number of our suppliers, Seagate and others, HP, that are doing great things and are really driving this forward, and we're really encouraged to see that at our supplier level, and we want to really applaud them for that and to encourage them to continue on that in that direction, because it helps us as well. And then the competitive advantage in the marketplace. There's this pre-competitive discussion I talked about, but there's also some great opportunities for these suppliers to position themselves at a competitive advantage if they do this right. So let me hand it back to Kathleen. Thank you so much for attending today. We know you could be doing a lot of other things other than listening to us, but thank you so much for taking time to consider our the information we share, and hopefully you'll be able to grab something that you can apply in your own organizations today. Kathleen?
Roger, thank you so much for that fabulous overview of why businesses care about this issue. Our next speaker is Bryan McGannon. He's Deputy Director for Policy and Engagement at the American Sustainable Business Council. Bryan has nearly a decade of experience working in our nation's capital on advocacy issues. He is leading ASBC's new initiative, Companies for Safer Chemicals, and he's going to tell you about that.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks, Lynn, for having me on the call today. It's great to be on the same panel as Mark and Roger, who are great folks who I learn something new from every time I hear them. So my name is Bryan McGannon, Deputy Director of Policy and Engagement with ASBC. I'm based from Washington, D.C. And ASBC is a council of business organizations and individual businesses who are working to build a sustainable economy. And one of our core issues has been, since our inception, has been toxic chemical reform. And just late last year, we got together with a number of our business members and decided that there was a voice lacking in the TSCA reform debate in Capitol Hill. And so we thought that this is a prime opportunity to organize companies who wanted to see meaningful reform, and we got together and formed Companies for Safer Chemicals. We launched in December of last year, and we turned some heads in the media and as well as on Capitol Hill, and now we're moving forward into some activities this year. So, you know, essentially, the backdrop to this is that most people probably know that TSCA is sorely out of date and ineffective. There's been a serious effort to reform it this year with the Lautenberg-Vitter bill, which after closer inspection really has a lot of trapdoors and does not do the job of protecting human and environmental health or incentivizing move to cleaner and safer products. So that was the impetus. That in the political dialogue, there's been businesses are represented by the American Chemistry Council, the major chemical manufacturers, versus the nonprofit community, which just wants to protect health. So you can see on the bottom of the screen there a few of our partners, and I'll show a lot more. But we've recruited over 115 companies to sign on to our declaration already, and we continue to grow. So the high-level principles that this group is going to be driving towards are true transparency, that both the public and businesses should have access to information regarding the safety of chemicals. It seems pretty straightforward, but it's a very challenging issue within the context of TSCA reform and CBI, which is the confidential business information. True safety it's pretty clear that federal law should set a minimum acceptable safety requirement. And if the federal government is not going to act, that the states should have the ability to write effective and innovative laws and regulations that will do the job. Currently in the Lautenberg-Vitter bill, the Chemical Safety Improvement Act, the states are preempted quite early and quite ineffectively. For example, the chemical spill in West Virginia would have been deemed a low priority chemical, and that would have banned the state government from reviewing that chemical and tied the hands of the state government, so they would not have been able to do any safety assessments of that chemical. And then innovation is a key factor of these businesses. We want policies that will drive innovation for cleaner and safer products, renewable chemicals, bio-based chemicals, that will drive those into the marketplace faster and more broadly. So the declaration can be found at this web address, and I'll have it at the end of my slides as well. And just if you hit the Take Action button is where you get to the actual declaration and the form to fill out. And that's our pretty straightforward action. We are compiling the logos and including the logos in our branding of this initiative on our website and in our materials. So if we do decide to join the effort, we're more than happy to position your company as well. Just a quick couple of initiatives that we are working on in the near term. We have a sign-on letter that will be circulating to all the members. The meeting the letter is done now, so we're looking to bring as many folks on as to be included on that letter. Next week, ASBC has organized a meeting with CEQ and the EPA. Half the conversation is going to be about climate and energy. The other half is going to be about chemicals. And we have Jim Jones speaking to us from the Assistant Administrator at EPA that manages TSCA and renewable chemicals. And that's next week. And then we are organizing a focused Companies for Safer Chemicals Lobby Day and Media Day on February 27th. And so we're encouraging executives from the coalition to participate in that day. I'm happy to, we'll stick around for more questions, and again, here's the link to get to the declaration. But thanks for having me, and I'll stick around.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's great to see that this group is forming for businesses to advocate for strong TSCA reform. Okay, so we have some time for questions, and just a second, I'm going to get my screen up here. We have a couple questions that have come in, but I encourage you to submit some questions on your little box on the screen. We do have a couple that have come in. One is about the green screen, and unfortunately Mark, I believe, had to drop off of the call because he had another obligation, but Roger and Brian are here to answer questions, and I will help to answer if I can. The question relating to how many chemicals are included in the green screen list translator, and what about chemicals that do not have toxicology data? This would have been a great question for Mark. We are going to be featuring the green screen on Friday's webinar, and I believe we'll be able to answer that question then. We have another question related to what software tools are available for businesses to collect chemical data, sustainability data, and data from suppliers while maintaining confidentiality. One of the things that is part of our project is we're providing a resources guide to all of the webinar participants, and we'll be mailing that to you, and it will have a list of many of the tools that are available, and examples of tools that can do that would be GreenWorks, the Good Guide Underwriters Laboratory Transparency Project, the 3E Green Product Analyzer, MFACT, Cyvera. There's more information in the guide, but I also wanted to give an opportunity for Roger, if you have any insights on tools, or if Staples uses any particular tools.
Sure, Kathleen. You've actually mentioned the ones, you listed those that we have been either looking at, having discussions with those organizations, or have implemented. GreenWorks, for instance, is one that we are, the Works organization, which is now part of UL Environmental, and Good Guide. They're excellent tools, and we would encourage our colleagues to take a look at those and to see if they fit your needs. You know, one size doesn't fit all here, but I think you captured them well, Kathleen.
Thanks, Roger. So I have another question for you, Roger, and that is, have there been any particular challenging issues in chemical replacement that Staples has dealt with in your supply chain? Sort of the sticky issues that are...
Yeah, absolutely. This isn't easy. And if it were that simple, I suspect it would have been done a long time ago. This is a very complex issue we're dealing with. So when we learn about a chemical of concern in a specific priority product that we are working on, the very first thing we do is talk to the supplier themselves. So the supplier that offers us that product now, we give them first crack at this. And basically say, make your case, tell us why that chemical's in that product, and explain to us why we should be comfortable with that chemical being in there. Sometimes they're able to do that. Most of the time they're not. Most of the time they're in trouble themselves because they've actually sourced this particular material from someone else. So there's these tiers of suppliers that are engaged. So the first challenge we have is, how do we create dialogue across all of these tiers so that we begin to consistently exchange information so that we don't get these impasses. So that would be one of them. The other is alternatives. Sometimes alternatives are offered with the same lack of information that we had in the primary material. So what we're asking the suppliers to do are to provide more robust information around the alternatives. So we shouldn't just, we don't want regrettable substitutions. So it's important that we ask the right questions and do the right research to make sure that we don't invest dollars in an alternative that later we have to change again. That's a couple of them.
That's great, and that kind of relates to a question that Bryan addressed, and that is the need for TSCA reform. If we have requirement for basic safety data, then that would be available. Bryan, I have a question for you. How have you seen, how have been the voices of businesses in Congress and in Washington? How important are those voices for the need for reform and for the specifics of what needs to be incorporated into reform?
The business voice is invaluable, especially from folks who want to see meaningful reform. You know, it changes the dialogue from a black and white us and them ACC versus the NGO community into a much more constructive. This is, you know, demonstrating that these are businesses that are doing or implementing this in their own practices, whether they're mission-driven or they're responding to consumer demand. That for the legislators and their staffs to understand what is actually possible instead of having, I'm going to say the ACC's extreme view of how legislation should be to protect their existing markets and practices. And versus, hey, look, we can make serious strides. Companies are profitable. These are the practices that are in place that the market is driving. It really does impact the legislative process positively, and there's a thirst for it on Capitol Hill. You know, I'm getting calls from Senator Boxer's office, other offices who are saying, hey, we want to hear from you. We want to know what your perspective is. Now is a great time to inject into the dialogue because, you know, we anticipate that Senator Boxer is going to make a move on TSCA reform in the near future. No one knows when or what, which makes our job fun. But it's just our voice outlining these critical principles. It really can help shape what comes out.
And along the same lines, do you hear from green chemistry companies about their unique needs, and would the campaign for safer chemicals play that role? Because obviously green chemistry companies are designing new chemicals. They might not have safety data on everything. They're trying to work with biomaterials that might be or may not be inherently safer. Is there sort of a forum for the green chemistry businesses?
Absolutely, they're absolutely welcome. And the intention of this coalition is to be as broad as possible. And it's still young enough that we could set up, a subcommittee or some substructure where that kind of dialogue is facilitated. But we've worked with a number of renewable chemicals within the ASBC's work, and there are some unique challenges as opposed to a company like 7th Generation, which is a consumer products company. So we think that the renewable space is incredibly valuable, and especially getting cleaner, safer chemicals into the market. Those companies are going to play a vital role, and so we've had great conversations with a number of companies that are starting to sign on, and we look forward to more, hopefully.
Great, thanks, Bryan. So we have another question that is, I think it's for you, Roger, as a follow-up to what you were saying about supply chain. How do you know that the data you're getting from suppliers or vendors is accurate, and who keeps it updated and how often?
Yeah, good question. I think this is a role that I think an agency like the EPA DFE program, for instance, can play an important role in, because often some of my business colleagues like to think of the EPA as this carrying a big stick and a club and, wanting to, invade their business community, when in reality there's some really good programs within the EPA that are partnership driven and have some incredible scientists on board and resources to be able to assess these kinds of things. So part of this is to ask the suppliers to validate their claims. It's part of the problem of TSCA in the past has been that it's been the requirement of government being you and me, to have to prove that a particular chemical is unsafe, when in reality maybe it should be just the other way around. And so we kind of challenge our suppliers that if you're going to make specific claims about your product and about the benefits of it, we need to have an understanding of what you build that on, what you base that on. So we need to see the science. And so we're careful not to transfer claims that are being made by a supplier directly into our customers until we are satisfied that the claim that they're making is anchored in sound science. And we do at times have some have to take some of the suppliers to the woodshed. So to be able to say, hey, let's don't be making these claims unless we can have the science to back them up. So we really put that responsibility on the supplier, and we recognize that that can be tough because they then have to go to their supplier, right? So if they're making a very complex type product where there are 5, 10 different suppliers they deal with to source from, that can be kind of a challenge for them. But we really think we're not going to fix this issue until we begin to do that and to connect the dots within the supply chain where that's done. As far as updating, what we do is we require companies to provide information to us and ask them that as they learn new information and new information becomes known to them, that they share that information with us. So it requires kind of a continuous dialogue with suppliers, which we already have. So the dialogue already exists at our merchant level. So it's just a matter of creating a new item that we talk about periodically in our quarterly reviews with those suppliers. So that's kind of how we do it. So we use internal mechanisms with our supplier, and we would also use third-party independent groups such as certifiers and the EPA DFE to review the science if we if we're don't have the resources internally to do that.
So it sounds like you really need constant vigilance and commitment to focus on the safety of your supply chain.
Yeah, that's right, Kathleen. Systems, creating systems is important.
Great. Here's a question. How do businesses or policymakers deal with trade-offs with respect to different performance metrics? So, for example, some chemicals or processes may be more energy efficient. They may save water. How do you prioritize the different greenness measures? And obviously, all of these are part of the 12 principles of green chemistry, but basically addressing the prioritization question.
Did you want me to take that, Kathleen?
Probably. Sorry,
okay.
Roger, you're getting the burden.
Too bad Mark isn't on. I think that would be a good one for him. I think in our case, from a company perspective, we can't only focus on one aspect of sustainability and expect that we're going to be able to make informed choices on that one thing. So, so it's important for us to look at trade-offs. Trade-offs are just part of life. So they're not something we can ignore. And if we ignore them, we're likely going to have them come back and bite us somewhere along the way. So the best approach to this is to take a holistic approach and to look at a product across the life cycle And when we say life cycle, you know, sometimes life cycle gets defined at the beginning and the end at different places. So some will, but if we really think about it, life cycle of a product begins at its sourcing of the material all the way to its end of life. And so it's important for us to be thinking about the impact of decisions we make around the product and ask our suppliers to consider those impacts at all those different places along the way, and then recognize we are going to have to ultimately at the end of the day make some trade-offs and some decisions that aren't always that easy, and not every company will always make them the same way. What guides us is our customers. So if customers say that we believe chemicals in products have a high priority over energy and waste, then we have to pay attention to that for our customer. It doesn't mean we ignore the others. It just means that that has boiled to the top of importance to that customer. And we're finding customers all over the board on this, Kathleen. So it's not consistent. We don't, all customers aren't asking for just energy reduction or waste reduction or recycling or, you know, take back programs. I mean, they're all over the place. So we as a company are challenged with having multiple ability to meet multiple needs from the marketplace, which is somewhat of a challenge, right? Because it's, you know, all of that costs resources and assets at the end of the day. But chemicals, we find lately, are beginning to be brought up much more often in discussions with our customers than ever before. So our business-to-business customers are actually boiling that to the top of their discussions, where, you know, 5 years ago, chemicals were way down in their list because they didn't, at that point, understand. It wasn't low-hanging fruit. Many of these sophisticated organizations are getting better understanding of this, and they're challenging us with this. So.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of companies prioritize energy efficiency first because you can save a lot of money doing it, and then look at goals for greenhouse gas emissions, and then chemical seems to come as a lower priority. But I'm glad to see that many companies are raising it up because it is an issue that customers care about. Let's see. So. Oh, here's another question, Roger, that I think is probably for you. How many Tier 2 or 3 suppliers do you audit for information accuracy?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I'm not sure I can answer that. That's much better for the people who are in our organization that are doing those activities, our quality folks. We certainly audit Tier 1 suppliers on a pretty regular basis, particularly in our Staples brand group, which are, you know, our own private brand, where we have much more control over decisions that are made. And I would suspect we have some access to Tier 2, but as we begin to drill down into these tiers, we have less and less ability to, you know, have impact. Where we can really have it is to apply enough requirement to the Tier 1 supplier that they have to then go to the 2 and 3 and 4 tiers. So that the idea is to ask the right questions of Tier 1, require the right things from Tier 1 to, so that they will initiate changes in their organization to go after that data. But it is difficult to have that. One of the things we're trying to do at Staples is to try to open up a more robust discussion with the chemical companies themselves, not with the notion here of trying to manipulate or in any way disrupt relationships between chemical companies and their suppliers, but frankly to have a dialogue of saying to the chemical companies, here are the challenges we're facing on the front end. We think we have a role to play in helping advance safer and more sustainable materials, but we need to understand more about what you're doing, and also maybe you need to understand at the chemical company level what we're doing and what we're facing, so we can find some pre-competitive ways to do this. So we're hoping that over the next year or so that we can begin to open some discussions, and it's a little tricky because, you know, we're going around we're kind of doing an end around here, and so we have to be respectful of the suppliers in between and not get them give them any measure of discomfort, and for them to recognize what we're trying to do is help them. We're trying to help the supplier deal with some barriers they have. And so, for instance, companies like ours can, we have access to markets for safer materials and, chemicals. We just have to figure out how to get comfortable with how to advance that forward.
Yeah, and going way back in the supply chain, in the chemistry lab, the chemists and the product designers have to make sure that whatever chemicals they're using is going to work in that particular product, and that it's also going to be cost effective. So green chemistry has to be effective, sustainable, and cost effective as well. So, okay, so I don't have a lot of questions coming in, but I'll ask a question. And that is for both Bryan and Roger. How important is being a sustainable or a company that cares about chemicals in the supply chain, cares about protecting health and the environment? How important is that to that particular company's brand? And what have you heard, Bryan, from companies?
The companies that we work with, it's vital. It's, I think most of our companies are mission driven, and I think that it's part of their brand identity. And I think a key piece of what they do is transparency in being honest with their customers. And so I think it's vital, and for our network. And I think it's more and more companies, as I think Roger's articulately saying, is that more and more companies are being responsive to that consumer demand, and that they're not going to have a choice anymore. The HBC type companies have kind of been out there on the leading edge for a long time, but I think most companies are waking up and being led because their consumers are saying, tell me what's in the product. If you have the bad stuff in it, I don't want to buy it.
Do you have anything to add, Roger, from Staples' perspective?
I would just say that the companies like Seventh Generation, Method, there are a number of these companies who have staked out positions. They're very important to driving this forward. They're demonstrating that being transparent, and transparency doesn't always mean that you get this, that transparency doesn't mean I only get to say the good things about what's going on. Transparency says we're going to lay it all out there for you to use to inform your decision making, and companies like that are doing that. And they get criticized from time to time, but at the end of the day, they're making a difference, and we're really glad to have companies like that as our suppliers. It challenges our more sophisticated, larger suppliers to demonstrate that themselves. So we think that that's very beneficial to drive change. We also have some very large companies who have sectors within them that are doing extraordinary things too. So you may have a very large company who could, in fact, be making the legacy chemicals that are under fire today, that are actually in certain sectors of their company doing some extraordinary things in this green chemistry space. We can see that at the Presidential Green Chemistry Awards. We can look at some of those companies that get those awards and recognize that those companies are doing extraordinary things, but at the same time we can do a quick Google search and find probably those companies being responsible for some of the chemicals that we're trying to work to get out of the supply chain. So there's this kind of dichotomy, there's kind of this irony going on today, but it's good. It shows that there's real movement even among legacy companies who have really trenched themselves in to defend their the investments they've made. At the same time, it's showing that when consumers and suppliers come along and suggest to go a different direction, that they are willing to, I mean, after all, if we can get their assets and resources directed in the right place, just think of the amazing things we can do. These chemical companies, if they were to take their R&D dollars and to shift some of that, even just a quarter of it, away from lobbying against chemicals out there, you know, to try to prevent legislation to, you know, to slow down the production of these products. Just imagine what could happen if we could get those dollars transformed into, you know, green chemistry. But the only way to do that is to create scalability and ability for these companies to have a place for their materials if they do invest in it. And I think that's the big gap right now, is many of these companies have already tried to invest those dollars in certain projects, and then when they get ready to go to market, there's barriers to get them to the market, because it could be even companies like ours are resistant to make the changes or to take the positions necessary to move. And we have to get that out of the way. We've got to figure out how to create a more robust marketplace for these materials when they do come to market. If we can't do that, then they will continue to spend their money to, you know, and they've got plenty of it in many cases, they'll spend it to impede the kinds of things Bryan talked about earlier that needs to be done in meaningful reform.
And that's a good segue to the next question. The question relates to bioplastics and the use of bioplastics and the market for it. What are the challenges as well? And we had a green chemistry conference here in Minnesota a couple weeks ago, and we heard from NatureWorks, who is the largest bioplastics company, I believe, in the world now, and they're making an array of goods, not just compostable flatware and plates and cups and so forth, but many durable goods made out of bioplastics. And I was wondering, Bryan, do you hear from companies about the importance of the bioplastics market? And also, Roger, are your customers, are you selling these products? Are your customers asking for them?
You know, a bit. We know the story of Stonyfield Farms, which is one of our ASBC members, and how they use NatureWorks chemical plastics for their cups, and they've, you know, realized improved performance in addition to the environmental health benefits. You know, it has that one specific kind of market has not kind of risen up out of the broader context of what we've been working on.
And Roger, is Staples carrying the bioplastics products?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we have those. We have those available within our broad assortment as options. That kind of points out the issue we were talking about earlier about understanding the alternatives and the trade-offs that could be in play. For instance, a bioplastic is still a plastic, and so if it's still a plastic, it may require other chemicals to make it functional. And so those other chemicals that are included in that to make that plastic functional for use in a real application can be just as problematic or more problematic than the primary plastic we've seen in some cases. And so we have to weigh that. In many cases, companies have figured that out and recognized that if they're going to go to bioplastics, they have to stay out of phthalates, they have to stay out of additives that are problematic as well. And so we like that kind of holistic approach, but particularly in, you know, we see it in plasticware, you know, forks, knives, spoons that are used in break rooms, for instance. We're seeing some of that material show up there, and it seems to be pretty functional and working pretty well, and I know we've had some growth in that sector. But the biggest use of plastics, I don't think we've gotten there yet, because there's an awful lot of plastics, as you know, being used across a whole lot of sectors, and we haven't seen yet enough scalability in that space, you know, to drive enough movement in that to do anything significant economically yet.
Great. Well, thanks, Roger and Brian. We're going to wrap up here. I'm going to make a couple of quick announcements. First of all, I wanted to tell you about the, my slides aren't moving. Anyway, the Safer Chemistry Challenge program. It's a program of the Pollution Prevention Institute, and they also have a Great Lakes Restoration Initiative grant to both conduct green screen trainings and also a couple of conferences on green chemistry, as well as to invite businesses to be part of the Safer Chemistry Challenge program. It's designed to motivate, challenge, assist, and recognize facilities that reduce the use of toxic chemicals of concern in the Great Lakes. There's a contact, which is Cindy McComas, and if my slide was showing, you could see the website, but it's p2.org, and we can send you in a follow-up email that information. We encourage businesses to participate in that and get recognized for reducing target pollutants that affect the Great Lakes. Finally, we have 2 more webinars coming up this Friday, January 31st. We have a webinar on hazard assessment tools, where you'll hear about the green screen as well as the chemical management system of the Outdoor Industry Association. And then on February 5th, life cycle impacts and third-party certification. We'll be mailing a resources guide that I mentioned to all participants following the last webinar. So look for that. And finally, I'd like to thank Mark Rossi, Roger McFadden, and Bryan McGannon for sharing their wisdom and expertise with us today. That concludes our webinar. Thanks so much for participating.